The boy in the courtroom. The grand courthouse stood like a fortress against the early autumn sky, its marble columns gleaming under the pale morning sun. To the students from Mason Elementary, it was a castle, a place of mystery and grown-up magic. The wide steps felt endless under their small feet, each one echoing with the excitement of adventure and the hushed warnings from their teachers to be on their best behavior. Among the sea of young faces was Malik Taylor, a 6-year-old with bright, curious eyes that seemed to drink in everything around him. His small hand clutched tightly at the fingers of his mother, Angela, who had taken time off from her third shift at the nursing home to chaperone the field trip. Her weary smile never faltered as she guided Malik up the steps, her free hand gently adjusting the strap of her worn purse. "Look, Mama." Malik's voice was barely a whisper, but his excitement bubbled up uncontrollably. He pointed at the towering wooden doors of courtroom 2B, their dark surface carved with intricate designs that made them look almost ancient. "That's where the judge sits, right? Like in my superhero book." Angela bent down, her curly hair falling gently over her shoulder as she smiled at him. "That's right, baby. The judge is like the captain of the courtroom. But remember, inside, we gotta be quiet, okay? Courtrooms are serious places." Malik nodded solemnly, but his mind was already painting pictures of a towering judge with a flowing cape, wielding a giant gavel like a hero's hammer. To him, the courtroom was less about law and more about justice, the kind his mama always said everyone deserved, even when life seemed unfair. The field trip was supposed to be simple, a brief introduction to the justice system, a look at how laws were followed, and maybe even a short mock trial to let the kids experience what it was like to stand in front of a real judge. But the moment Judge Garrett Henshaw swept into the room, it was clear the day would not go as planned. Henshaw was a man built of stern angles, his thin mouth set in a permanent frown, his sharp eyes scanning the room as though it were filled with guilty parties rather than fidgeting first graders. His black robe flowed behind him like a shadow, and his polished gavel rested on the bench like a loaded weapon. The children hushed immediately at his presence, sensing instinctively that this man was not to be trifled with, all except for Malik. Malik's hand shot up, his little face beaming with enthusiasm. "Excuse me, sir. Your Honor, is that your hammer? Do you fight bad guys with it like Captain Justice?" The classroom erupted in laughter, a ripple of innocent giggles that bounced off the marble walls. But Judge Henshaw did not smile. His glare turned sharp, cutting through the noise like a blade. "This," he said, lifting the gavel with a deliberate slowness, "is not a toy, young man. This is a symbol of authority and discipline, something you clearly lack." His cold gaze swept over Malik, pausing just long enough to make the little boy shrink into his mother's side. "You're just another kid who won't follow the rules." The room fell silent. Even the teachers didn't quite know how to respond. Angela's hand tightened around Malik's, her jaw clenching. But she said nothing. Experience had taught her that speaking up often made things worse. Instead, she knelt beside her son, whispering in his ear, "Don't let nobody dim your shine, baby. You're not bad. You're just curious. That's a good thing." But Malik wasn't sure. The judge's words clung to him like damp clothes, and for the rest of the tour, he stayed quiet, his shoulders hunched under the weight of being singled out. His bright imagination, the same spark that made him draw superheroes and dream of being one, felt smaller, like a candle flickering in the wind. The tour continued through the hallways lined with framed photos of past judges, all stern and unyielding, as though carved from the same unforgiving stone. The class peeked into other courtrooms where real cases unfolded, grown-ups with heavy faces standing before judges much like Henshaw, their lives seemingly decided with the strike of that big wooden hammer. Angela couldn't stop glancing at her son, his usual spark dimmed. She knew that look. It was the same one she saw in the mirror after a long shift, when someone talked down to her because of her uniform or the color of her skin. It was the weight of being dismissed before you were even heard. Later that afternoon, after the tour ended and the class returned to their yellow buses, Angela and Malik took the long walk home. The corner store was their last stop, a small grocery shop run by a grumpy old man named Mr. Clemens, who always eyed Malik suspiciously, as if he expected the boy to pocket candy bars at any moment. Angela had only a few dollars left after paying rent, just enough for milk, bread, and a small treat for Malik. As she counted her change at the counter, Malik stood by the shelf of colorful snacks, carefully choosing the perfect candy bar with the care of someone selecting a treasure. But the moment he reached for one, Mr. Clemens' voice rang out like a shot. "Hey, I saw that. Put it back, you little thief." Malik's hand froze. His eyes widened with panic, and his lip quivered. "I wasn't stealing, sir. I was just looking." Angela spun around, her tired eyes flashing with anger. "He wasn't stealing. My son's not a thief." "Sure," Mr. Clemens sneered. "They all say that." They. The word was a slap, sharp and unmistakable. Angela stepped between her son and the man, her voice low but unyielding. "My son is not they. He's a child. A good child." Before the argument could escalate, the door's bell jingled, and someone else stepped inside. A tall, familiar figure in a black coat and leather gloves. Judge Henshaw. The man's eyes flicked from Angela to Malik to the shopkeeper. His expression was unreadable, but something in his gaze lingered on Malik, a flicker of recognition. "Is there a problem here?" "No problem," Angela said quickly, though her jaw was tight. "Just a misunderstanding." But Malik's voice was small. "I didn't steal anything." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, the same cold gaze he'd worn in the courtroom. "I hope not. We have enough troublemakers in this neighborhood." Angela's fists clenched at her sides, but she said nothing. She knew how quickly the world could turn against a boy like Malik. Instead, she took his hand, left the groceries on the counter, and led him out the door, her heart pounding in her chest. They walked home in silence, the judge's words echoing in her ears. "Just another kid who won't follow the rules. But the universe has a way of turning tables." That night, as the autumn rain slicked the streets, Judge Henshaw's sleek sedan skidded on a patch of oil. Tires screamed, and metal crunched as the car spun, crashing into a crumbling lamppost at the edge of the neighborhood. The engine hissed, smoke curling from beneath the hood as the judge stumbled out, his ankle twisted, his phone shattered on the pavement. He stood there, drenched and limping, when a soft, hesitant voice called out, "Do you need help, sir?" The same bright-eyed boy he humiliated hours before stood there in a worn hoodie, his mother not far behind, her eyes wary but kind. The judge's world tilted. The boy he'd dismissed, the boy he'd labeled, was now his only hope. When kindness comes knocking. The rain drummed a soft rhythm on the cracked pavement, each drop dissolving into the murky puddles gathered in the uneven asphalt. The dim glow of a street lamp flickered overhead, half shielded by the jagged limb of a tree, its leaves dripping from the storm's earlier downpour. Judge Garrett Henshaw leaned heavily against the crumpled front of his luxury sedan, the harsh metallic groan of twisted metal a cruel echo in his ears. His ankle throbbed with every shift of weight, and his soaked trousers clung to his legs like heavy chains. His shattered phone lay in a watery grave beside the curb, its screen flickering faintly before giving up entirely. For the first time in years, Henshaw was truly helpless. And standing there in front of him, small, hesitant, and far too familiar, was Malik Taylor. The same boy he had dismissed as just another kid who wouldn't follow the rules. "Do you need help, sir?" Malik asked again, his voice small, but the concern behind it was unmistakable. Angela stood just behind her son, her grocery bag balanced carefully in her left arm, her right hand resting protectively on Malik's shoulder. Her eyes, dark with caution and memory, swept over the scene, the damaged car, the hobbled judge, and the deepening night. Judge Henshaw was too stunned to respond at first. It was absurd. This boy, this mother, the very people he had dismissed without a second thought now stood offering him aid. Angela spoke first, her voice carrying the quiet authority of a woman who had spent her whole life cleaning up after other people's messes. "You're hurt. Let me take a look." I'm fine," Henshaw muttered, though his wince gave him away as he shifted weight onto his injured ankle. "Doesn't look fine to me," Angela said, already setting her bag down and stepping closer. "You can't stand out here all night." Henshaw's pride bristled. He was used to authority flowing in one direction, his. Judges didn't ask for help, especially not from the people they ruled over. But the sharp throb of pain and the reality of his isolation wore down his resistance. "I suppose I could use some help," he admitted, his voice quieter than intended. Angela turned to Malik. "Sweetheart, grab that crate from the alley. We need something to support his foot." Malik dashed off, returning moments later with a plastic milk crate, still damp from the rain. Angela guided Henshaw to sit on the curb, resting his foot on the crate with surprising gentleness. Malik watched silently, his wide eyes studying the judge with equal parts curiosity and suspicion. "I remember you," Malik said finally, his voice hesitant but clear. "You're the one with the big hammer." Henshaw's gaze flickered down to the boy, guilt washing over him like a second storm. "The gavel," he corrected softly. "It's called a gavel." Malik gave a small nod, filing the word away. "Do you still think I'm bad?" Henshaw's throat tightened. A lifetime of judgments made in seconds, and yet this 6-year-old's question felt heavier than any case he had ever ruled on. "No," Henshaw said, his voice hoarse. I was wrong." The words felt foreign in his mouth, like a language he had never spoken aloud. Angela stood, brushing her hands on her jeans. "We live a few blocks away. You can't stay here with a busted car and a bad ankle. Let's get you inside." Henshaw opened his mouth to protest, to say he could handle it, that someone would come for him. But the truth sat bitter on his tongue. There was no one. No family waiting for him at home. No emergency contacts listed on his phone. Just an empty house and a career built on distance. He nodded. And so, with Malik on one side and Angela on the other, the stern-faced judge limped down the uneven sidewalk, toward a home smaller and warmer than any courtroom he had ever presided over. The Taylor apartment was humble. Chipped paint on the walls, second-hand furniture that didn't quite match, and a faint scent of laundry detergent and cinnamon that filled the air. A crocheted blanket lay folded over the worn sofa, and Malik's schoolwork was spread across the kitchen table. Angela helped Henshaw settle into the armchair, propping his ankle up with a stack of old textbooks. Malik, ever eager to be helpful, dashed to the kitchen and returned with a half-empty bag of frozen peas, which Angela wrapped in a dish towel and laid gently over the swelling. "Do you need to call anyone?" Angela asked, her voice neutral. There was no mockery, only quiet practicality. "No phone," Henshaw muttered. "It broke." Angela arched an eyebrow. "Then you're stuck with us for now." She said it matter-of-factly, not cruelly, just a truth, like the sky was blue or the rent was due. Henshaw could hardly fathom it. In all his years on the bench, he had never once imagined needing kindness from someone like Angela Taylor. Malik climbed onto the couch, swinging his legs. "Do you really send people to jail?" he asked, his voice full of curiosity rather than fear. "Sometimes," Henshaw replied, surprised at how natural it felt to answer. "But not everyone who comes to court is bad. Some people just made mistakes." Malik nodded solemnly. "Mama says everybody makes mistakes, but that doesn't mean they're bad." Angela's back stiffened slightly, but she said nothing, her hands busy straightening the pile of unopened bills on the side table. Henshaw took in the room, the faded family photos, the scuffed floorboards, the chipped coffee table, and felt something stir uncomfortably in his chest. He had ruled on eviction cases just like this. Families reduced to statistics on legal briefs, faces he never saw, lives he never considered beyond the cold facts presented. This was one of those lives. The clock ticked quietly as the three of them sat in silence. The powerful judge, the tired mother, the curious boy, an unlikely triangle drawn together by circumstance and chance. Hours later, a tow truck finally arrived, summoned by Angela's old friend who worked at a nearby garage. Henshaw stood awkwardly by the door, his ankle wrapped in a borrowed ace bandage, his coat now draped over his shoulders. Angela handed him a scrap of paper with a handwritten phone number. "That's the garage number. They'll give you a fair price." "Thank you," Henshaw said, his voice stiff with discomfort. Gratitude was unfamiliar terrain. Angela nodded, already moving on, her mind likely on Malik's dinner and the bills stacked neatly on the counter. Malik stood in the doorway, his small face serious. "Are you gonna be nicer now?" he asked. Henshaw blinked. "What do you mean?" Malik shrugged. "You didn't look at me before." "Not really. You just thought I was bad. But Mama says sometimes people need second chances." A lump rose in Henshaw's throat. "Maybe I do." Malik grinned, satisfied with the answer. "Bye, Mr. Hammerman." For the first time in longer than he could remember, Henshaw smiled. A real smile. Small, unsure, but genuine. "Goodbye, Malik." As the tow truck's headlights swept down the street, Angela watched from the window, arms crossed. She wasn't naive. She knew how the world worked, how men like Judge Henshaw saw families like hers. But something about the way the old man had softened around her son, even for a moment, left a sliver of space for possibility. Sometimes, kindness didn't change the world overnight, but it could crack the door open. And sometimes, that was enough. The weight of the gavel. The sky over the city was still ink-dark when Judge Garrett Henshaw slipped into the courthouse through the side entrance, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors. The quiet suited him. There were no bailiffs, no lawyers, no whispers from the gallery, just silence, and the whisper of his own thoughts, now louder than they had been in years. His ankle still throbbed from the night before, a constant reminder of the boy and his mother who had offered him a kindness he didn't deserve. He sank into the heavy leather chair behind his bench in courtroom 2B, his fingers tracing the worn edges of the gavel. The same gavel Malik had called his hero hammer. He had dismissed the boy with such ease, reducing him to a category, a statistic, just another kid who won't follow the rules. But now, Henshaw could still feel the weight of Malik's small hand in his as they'd walked him home, the warmth of Angela's steady grip on his other side. They had carried him, not just his weight, but his pride, his broken sense of control. And they had done it without judgment. It was the kind of grace he had never shown anyone who stood before his bench. The gavel felt heavier today. By mid-morning, the courthouse buzzed with life. Attorneys rushed from chamber to chamber, paralegals hauled stacks of files, and nervous plaintiffs perched on wooden benches, waiting to have their lives reduced to brief arguments and legal jargon. Henshaw had seen this all for decades. It should have been familiar, but it wasn't. The first case of the day was a tenant eviction hearing, a familiar script. The landlord's lawyer spoke first, a polished young man with a tie too tight and a smile too rehearsed. The tenant, an exhausted single mother named Lucia, stood at the defendant's table, her hands trembling. Henshaw glanced at the file. Past due rent, mold complaints, repairs ignored. He had seen it all before. But then he remembered Angela's apartment, the peeling paint, the uneven floors, the piles of unopened bills. Lucia's hands trembled the same way Angela's had when she sorted through envelopes with red stamps. It was the trembling of someone who had learned the system was not built for them. For the first time in years, Henshaw asked a question the court rarely heard from his lips. "Miss Alvarez, would you like to explain why you've fallen behind on your rent?" The young lawyer objected immediately, citing irrelevant personal details, but Henshaw raised a hand to silence him. Lucia's voice shook as she spoke, her daughter's asthma, made worse by the mold in the bathroom. Her hours at the laundromat cut after a new manager came in. Her struggles to file maintenance requests that disappeared into the void. Each word painted a story far deeper than the legal brief before him. In the gallery, other tenants watched, wide-eyed. This was not how Judge Henshaw's courtroom was supposed to work. His reputation had always been clear, fast, cold, no nonsense. Yet today, the old judge leaned forward, his gavel untouched, his eyes actually seeing the person before him. "Motion to delay eviction," Henshaw said, surprising even himself. "Pending inspection of the premises." Lucia's lawyer blinked, stunned, before nodding in agreement. The landlord's lawyer opened his mouth to protest, but one glance from Henshaw shut him down. The gavel came down softly. For the first time, it felt less like a hammer, and more like a door being opened. The whispers spread quickly through the courthouse. Something was different about Judge Henshaw. The next case was a probation violation hearing for Devin Price, a 19-year-old arrested for missing his check-in with his parole officer. The prosecutor rattled off Devin's history: petty theft, curfew violations, painting a portrait of yet another young man destined for a cell. Devin slouched at the defense table, eyes locked on the floor. Henshaw saw Malik in him, the same bright curiosity, dulled too soon by labels and assumptions. "Mr. Price," Henshaw said, his voice softer than usual. "Why did you miss your appointment?" Devin shifted, uncomfortable. "Bus pass expired. Couldn't get a ride." "Did you tell your parole officer that?" Henshaw asked. Devin shook his head. Didn't think it'd matter. The courtroom held its breath. Once, Henshaw would have snapped about personal responsibility, about how excuses didn't matter in a court of law. But today, all he could see was a boy who had learned too young that the system wasn't built to listen. Henshaw took a breath. "Get him a new transit pass," he said to the clerk. "He's reinstated on probation. But I want him back here next week, so I can hear how things are going." Devin's eyes widened in shock. The prosecutor sputtered. Even the court reporter paused, uncertain whether to record correctly. "Are we clear, Mr. Price?" Henshaw said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Yes, sir," Devin mumbled, disbelief washing over him. The gavel fell again, but quieter. Lunchtime found Henshaw in his chambers, the door closed, the walls pressing in. His hands trembled slightly as he poured his coffee. This new way of judging felt as alien as a foreign language. He had spent decades believing the law was the only language that mattered. But laws were cold things without the people they were meant to protect. The people like Malik and Angela, like Lucia and Devin. There was a knock at his door, and Judge Eleanor Wainwright stepped inside, her arms folded over her dark blue blazer. Her sharp eyes scanned him with curiosity and warning. "Word's spreading," she said, her tone careful, "that you've gone soft." Henshaw exhaled slowly. "Is that what they're calling it?" "Some are calling it a breakdown," Wainwright added, though there was no malice in her voice. "What's really going on?" Henshaw stared into his coffee, the steam curling upward like a ghost. "I saw something I can't unsee." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Wainwright studied him for a long moment. "You've built a career on being the hardest judge in the courthouse," she said quietly. "If you change now, people are going to question everything you've ever ruled on." "Maybe they should," Henshaw replied. "Maybe I should." For a long moment, Wainwright said nothing. Then, with a faint smile, she nodded. "It's not weakness, Garrett. It's growth." That evening, Henshaw found himself parked in front of the Taylor apartment, the street bathed in the orange glow of a dying sunset. He didn't know why he was there. Some part of him felt drawn to that tiny space, the place where he had been made small, not by force, but by kindness. He knocked, and Malik answered, his face lighting up instantly. "Mr. Hammerman," the boy exclaimed, flinging the door wide. "Come in." Angela appeared, her eyebrows raising in surprise, but she stepped aside, letting Henshaw into the warm, cluttered living room. Henshaw hesitated, unused to this kind of vulnerability. "I wanted to say thank you." Angela's arms crossed, her posture wary but open. "For what?" "For not leaving me on that sidewalk," Henshaw said simply, "and for showing me what justice actually looks like." Angela's gaze softened just a little, but her voice stayed firm. "Justice isn't just rules on paper, Judge. It's what you do when no one's watching." Malik tugged at Henshaw's sleeve. "Do you want to see my new superhero story?" Henshaw knelt beside him, watching the boy's small fingers flip through pages of crayon drawings. Every hero Malik drew held a gavel, not as a weapon, but as a tool to help. And for the first time in his long career, Judge Garrett Henshaw wondered if he could be one of them. The cost of change. The courthouse was not built for change. Its walls were made of stone and tradition, its ceilings high enough to make any man feel small beneath them. The marble floors had been polished by decades of careful steps, the kind taken by people afraid to challenge the system they served. That was the way Judge Garrett Henshaw had once walked those halls, confident, untouchable, cloaked in authority like armor. But now, as he entered courtroom 2B for the third day in a row with a different posture, less rigid, more uncertain, he could feel the stares. They were waiting for him to return to form, to snap back into the judge they knew, the one who handed down rulings without hesitation, who saw rules as immovable pillars, and compassion as an indulgence for the weak. But that man was unraveling, thread by thread. The first sign of trouble came with the morning's mail. A letter, typed neatly on thick stationery, lay on his desk before his first case began. The seal in the corner was unmistakable: the Judicial Oversight Committee. Henshaw let the weight of the envelope sit in his hands before opening it. The language was carefully constructed, but the message was clear. Concerns have been raised regarding recent deviations from established judicial norms. An internal review of your rulings and courtroom conduct is being initiated to ensure adherence to impartiality and judicial standards. A formal warning. It was the system's polite way of saying, "You're making waves. We're watching." He set the letter aside, but its presence shadowed every word he spoke that day. The afternoon brought a familiar face to his courtroom, Angela Taylor. But she wasn't there for herself. She stood beside her neighbor, Mrs. Juanita Green, who was in her 70s and had lived in her building since before Angela was born. A developer had recently bought the property and started citing safety violations, all suspiciously timed after Juanita refused to sell her rent-controlled unit. The landlord's lawyer, slick-haired and gleaming with confidence, smiled politely as he listed off reasons why Mrs. Green's eviction was necessary for safety. But Henshaw saw the game for what it was. He thought about Malik's drawings, about Angela's quiet strength, about the cold mornings when families had lined up outside housing court with eviction papers in trembling hands. "Mr. Carlson," Henshaw said, addressing the lawyer, "what repairs has your client completed on the property in the last 5 years?" The lawyer's smile faltered. "Repairs, Your Honor." "Yes," Henshaw said, leaning back slightly. "You cite safety as a primary concern. Surely your client has documented evidence of maintaining safety standards, routine inspections, plumbing repairs, electrical updates." Carlson's silence was telling. Henshaw's voice sharpened. It would seem inappropriate to cite safety concerns as grounds for eviction if no prior effort was made to ensure the building's safety before new ownership. Carlson stammered, flipping through papers that offered no such records. "Motion to dismiss," Henshaw said simply. "The eviction is denied." Gasps rippled through the gallery, not from Mrs. Green's supporters, who burst into quiet applause, but from the lawyers who had built their careers on easy wins in front of Henshaw's bench. Angela caught Henshaw's eye as she guided Mrs. Green out of the courtroom. For the first time, she offered him a smile, not polite, but genuine. The backlash was swift. By the next morning, Judge Richard Kendall, the courthouse's longest-serving judge and Henshaw's one-time mentor, cornered him in the corridor outside the judge's lounge. "Garrett," Kendall's voice was low, but his tone was steel. "I'm hearing things." Henshaw held his gaze. "What kinds of things?" "Developers are complaining that you're politicizing your courtroom," Kendall said, adjusting his cufflinks. "They're calling you biased, activist, even." "We don't do activism, Garrett. We apply the law." Henshaw's jaw clenched. "The law exists to serve the people, Richard. All the people. That's not how you've ruled for the past 20 years. Kendall's voice softened. "You have a reputation. A good one. Why throw it away now?" "Because that reputation was built on distance," Henshaw thought. "Because I was blind by choice." Instead of answering, he said, "If applying the law fairly is activism, then maybe we need more of it." Kendall shook his head, disappointment flickering across his face. "Be careful, Garrett. You're no good to anyone if you lose that robe." The story didn't stay inside the courthouse. A reporter from the City Tribune, a young woman with a notebook too big for her hands, approached Angela at the laundromat the next evening. "I heard about the Green case," the reporter said, her pen poised. "And the delay ruling on Lucia Alvarez. They're saying Judge Henshaw's different. Do you know why?" Angela folded a towel slowly. "I don't speak for the judge," she said carefully. "Off the record," the reporter pressed, "is it true your son helped him after his accident?" Angela's fingers paused. "What does my son have to do with anything?" The reporter smiled. "People love stories about redemption." Angela's jaw tightened. "This isn't a story." But the reporter was already scribbling. The article ran the next day. "The Hammerman's Heart. Has the courthouse's toughest judge gone soft?" It painted Henshaw as a man humbled by circumstance, a feared judge saved by a boy from the very community he had ruled against for years. It was half true, half fantasy, but it spread like wildfire. By noon, Henshaw's clerk was fielding calls from every major paper in the state. By evening, the Judicial Oversight Committee had scheduled his formal review hearing. Angela found Henshaw later that night, sitting in his car outside her apartment. She tapped on the window until he rolled it down. "You really shouldn't sit out here like that," she said, arms crossed against the chill. "People might think you're casing the place." The joke was light, but her eyes were serious. Henshaw gave a weak smile. "I'm sorry." "For what?" she asked, leaning against the door. "For dragging you and Malik into this media circus." Angela shook her head. "You didn't drag us anywhere. We stepped up, because people like us have to." He rested his head back against the seat. "I spent my whole career pretending the system was fair just because the rules were clear." "And now?" she asked. "Now I know the rules only work if they're built for everyone." His voice cracked slightly. "And they're not." Angela sighed, the weight of that truth sitting heavy between them. "It took you long enough." They both laughed. A tired, knowing laugh between two people who had lived on opposite sides of the glass for too long. "Malik's got a new drawing for you," Angela said after a pause. "Wants you to have it before your hearing." "My hearing?" Henshaw asked. Angela's smile was wry. "You really think they're gonna let you change the rules without a fight?" The next morning, Malik bounded into the living room, a rolled-up sheet of paper in his hands. "Mr. Hammerman's coming today, right?" Angela nodded. "He'll be here." Malik unrolled his drawing proudly. It showed a figure in a black robe, the same figure he'd drawn before. But this time, the judge stood beside a smaller figure, a boy. They were both holding the gavel together, lifting it high above a crowd of people holding signs that read "Fair housing for all and justice is for everyone." The caption underneath read, "Superheroes work together." The hearing room was packed. Judges in crisp robes lined the table at the front. Lawyers from corporate firms filled the gallery. But so did Angela, Malik, and Mrs. Green, along with Lucia Devon and nearly 30 other residents who had once stood before Henshaw's bench. The lead investigator read the charges. deviation from judicial norms, improper consideration of personal circumstances, and potential conflict of interest. Henshaw stood. His hands were steady. Justice, he said, isn't just a set of rules. It's a living promise to every person, not just the privileged. I failed that promise for years. He looked at Angela, then Malik. I'm trying to fix that. The gallery erupted in applause. And for the first time, the gavel in his hand felt right. When the system fights back, the hearing ended, but the storm was just beginning. Judge Garrett Henshaw stood alone in the courthouse hallway, his back pressed against the cold marble wall, the echoes of applause from the community still ringing in his ears. It should have been comforting, a sign that the people he once overlooked were finally seeing him as an ally. But all he could feel was the weight of the backlash pressing down on him like a lead blanket. Across the hall, Judge Richard Kendall watched him through the glass window of his office door, the disappointment on his face so sharp it might as well have been carved in stone. Henshaw knew what came next. The system doesn't just bend because one judge grows a conscience. It protects itself. And when someone inside that system starts pulling at the seams, the whole machine turns against them. The first letter came the next morning. Formal notification of disciplinary review proceedings, effective immediately. The Judicial Oversight Committee wasn't satisfied with a gentle warning. They wanted blood. Every ruling Henshaw had made in the last 90 days was flagged for review. Every case he'd handled under the new compassionate lens, now a potential argument for his removal. The language was cold, clinical. Deviation from precedent. Potential bias. Judicial overreach. Misapplication of housing statutes. They didn't care that Mrs. Green's eviction was based on lies, or that Devin Price had no way to get to his probation officer. They cared that Henshaw had seen those people as human beings, and that to the system was a dangerous precedent. Henshaw could feel the shift inside the courthouse like a ripple through still water. Some clerks stopped making eye contact. A few attorneys whispered louder when he passed. Judge Kendall had always been cordial, if distant, but now he wouldn't even nod in passing. To them, Henshaw was contaminated. Even some of his own peers, judges who had once shared quiet lunches and polite conversation in the lounge, looked at him now like he was the virus that could bring down the whole building. "Careful," said Eleanor Wainwright, one of the few judges still speaking to him. She set her coffee down next to his at the long oak table in the break room. "They're circling." "I noticed," Henshaw said dryly. "I mean it, Garrett," she said, her voice quieter. "They're not going to just review your cases. They're looking for an excuse to tear your entire record apart. If they find even one old case with sloppy procedure, they'll use it." Henshaw stared into his coffee, the steam curling upward like a ghost of the man he used to be. "Let them." Eleanor's brows lifted. "You really want to go down with this ship? If the ship is rotten, it deserves to sink." She leaned back, studying him. "That's the thing about you, Garrett. You were never brave. You were careful, controlled. Now you're ready to torch the whole building." He met her gaze. "Maybe the building needs burning." The next day, Angela found herself on the receiving end of the system's retaliation. The repair requests she'd filed for her own apartment, requests that had been ignored for months, were suddenly under review. Code enforcement officers showed up without warning, pointing out minor infractions, a crack in the window frame, a leaky pipe under the kitchen sink. Things the landlord had refused to fix were now being used against her. A formal warning of eviction was taped to her door before sunset. Angela stood in her kitchen, her hands gripping the edge of the counter so hard her knuckles turned white. Malik sat at the table, coloring a new comic, unaware of the storm brewing just beyond their door. The system had found its target. Angela was collateral damage. That evening, Henshaw knocked at her door. His tie was loose, his hair slightly disheveled. A man caught between who he was and who he was becoming. Angela opened the door just wide enough to see his face, but she didn't step aside. "They're coming after you," Henshaw said. his voice low. Because of me. Angela's jaw was tight, but her voice was calm. This isn't the first time someone's tried to push me out of my home. It shouldn't happen at all, he said. I can help. Angela's eyes flashed. Help? Like you helped all those families you ruled against for 20 years. You knew how the system worked, Judge. You knew, and you didn't care. Until it landed on your doorstep. Henshaw didn't flinch. He deserved every word. You're right, he admitted. But I care now. I see it now. Angela sighed, the fight draining from her shoulders. What exactly do you think you can do? He held up a thin folder, copies of every repair request, sheets submitted, dates, photos, all logged. The law protects tenants from retaliatory eviction. Henshaw said, if you want, I'll file a petition to block it. Angela hesitated, torn between pride and practicality. Please, Henshaw added softly, let me do at least this much. After a moment, Angela opened the door wider. Come in. The community meeting at the local church was packed that weekend. Folding chairs filled the basement, and families stood shoulder to shoulder against the walls, their faces wary but hopeful. Angela sat near the front, Malik beside her, proudly holding up a new poster he'd made. Across the top in big, bold letters were the words, Justice belongs to all of us. Beneath it, Malik had drawn a lineup of superheroes, but they weren't caped and masked. They were neighbors, mothers, workers, students, all holding gavels. At the center was Judge Henshaw, not towering, but standing with them. When Henshaw took the microphone, there was no courtroom bench to shield him, no robe to hide behind. Just a man with thinning hair, tired eyes, and a voice not used to trembling. I spent my whole life believing the law was a wall, he said, his voice carrying through the hall. That my job was to make sure people stayed on the right side of it. But the law isn't supposed to be a wall. It's supposed to be a bridge. The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. I can't fix the past, Henshaw continued, but I can stand with you now. And I will. Someone clapped, then another, until the room was filled with the sound of hope and possibility. The next day, Angela's petition was filed, with Henshaw listed as her advocate of record. It was unheard of, a sitting judge publicly advocating for a tenant in a housing dispute. The courthouse buzzed with disbelief, but outside the courthouse, something incredible happened. Other tenants started filing too. Armed with their own evidence, repair requests, and stories, families began fighting back, and the fight didn't stop at the courthouse. The stories spread, from local blogs to national headlines. The judge who switched sides. But the system wasn't done. The Judicial Oversight Committee moved up Henshaw's formal hearing, citing urgent concerns regarding impartiality and judicial ethics. The charges were clear. Inappropriate advocacy. Political activism from the bench. Breach of judicial neutrality. If found guilty, he would lose his seat, his pension, his legacy. Angela heard the news from a reporter. That night, she stood in her living room, the eviction notice still taped to the wall. Malik was asleep, his latest drawing tucked under his pillow. A picture of a judge and a boy standing together, holding a banner that said, "We fight together." Angela knew what she had to do. The hearing room was standing room only. Henshaw sat alone at the front table, but behind him stood Angela, Mrs. Green, Lucia, Devon, and dozens more. A living wall of testimony and strength. Malik stood on a chair in the back, holding his poster high. Angela stepped forward when the panel asked if anyone wished to speak on Henshaw's behalf. She raised her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "This judge," she said, "finally sees us. The system could review every case, every ruling. But they couldn't erase the truth." The gavel falls. The hearing room was too small to hold the weight of what was happening inside. Rows of people filled the space, not just lawyers and officials in stiff suits, but families in worn jackets and scuffed shoes. The people who had been quietly pushed to the edges of the system now stood at the center of it. There were mothers who had fought illegal evictions, grandfathers who had lost homes to developers, and young men like Devin Price, whose entire future had been written off by the same system they were now demanding to change. At the center of it all sat Judge Garrett Henshaw, no longer wearing his robe, no longer shielded by the formality of his bench. He sat in a simple chair at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, a man no longer protected by the weight of his title. This time, he was the one being judged. The Judicial Oversight Committee, a panel of 5 judges, all older, all men Henshaw had once called colleagues, stared down at him with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright disdain. They saw not a hero, not a man who had found his conscience. They saw a traitor. Judge Henshaw, the lead panelist, Justice Moretti, said, adjusting his glasses as though even looking at Henshaw was difficult. We are here to determine whether your conduct in recent months has violated the principles of judicial neutrality and the ethical standards expected of a member of the bench. Henshaw's mouth was dry, but his voice held steady. I understand. Moretti steepled his fingers. You have been accused of allowing personal relationships to influence your rulings, advocating for tenants outside of the courtroom, and engaging in what has been described as judicial activism. Henshaw could feel the eyes of the community behind him. Angela stood near the back, her arms crossed, her head held high. Malik sat on the lap of Mrs. Green, his small hands gripping a folded-up drawing. A new one, judging by the bright edges of fresh crayon marks. I would like to make a statement before we proceed, Henshaw said. Moretti sighed, but nodded. Henshaw stood, and for a moment, the hush in the room felt heavier than any silence he had ever felt in his courtroom. For more than 30 years, Henshaw began. I believed that my job was to apply the law as written, no matter who stood before me. The committee members nodded in unison. That was the code. That was the shield they had all hidden behind. I believed that if the rules were followed, justice would naturally happen. His voice caught for just a second. I was wrong. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I saw the law as a wall, cold, neutral, immovable. But walls don't serve justice. People do. His eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Angela. And when I finally stepped outside of that wall, when I saw who it was keeping out, I realized I had spent my career protecting the wrong side. One of the committee members, Judge Whitfield, leaned forward. That is not your role, Judge Henshaw. Judges interpret law, not rewrite it. Henshaw's smile was faint but real. I'm not trying to rewrite the law. I'm trying to remember what it was supposed to be for in the first place. People, families, children like Malik Taylor. Heads turned toward Malik, who held up his crayon drawing high. It was a picture of Henshaw, standing beside a little boy and his mother, all of them holding hands in front of a building labeled Justice for All. There were no capes, no superpowers, just people standing together. You want to discipline me for remembering who the law is supposed to serve. Henshaw's voice grew stronger. Go ahead. But I would rather lose this seat than go back to being the man who sat behind that bench, blind to the people whose lives I was deciding. Justice Moretti's face was stone. This is not a rally, Judge Henshaw. No, Henshaw said quietly. But it should be. Behind him, Angela stepped forward. With all due respect, Justice Moretti, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. This committee needs to hear from the people who've been on the other side of Judge Henshaw's decisions. That's not standard procedure, Whitfield began. Neither is justice, apparently, Angela interrupted. The crowd chuckled softly, but her face was serious. We've been talked about and ruled on and pushed aside for too long. If you're going to judge this man for trying to help us, you need to at least listen to us. Moretti's lips pressed into a thin line. You may speak, briefly. Angela took a deep breath and stepped to the front. When I first met Judge Henshaw, he called my son just another kid who won't follow the rules. Her voice didn't tremble, but her hands gripped the edges of the podium tightly. That's all we've ever been to this system. Another case number. Another problem. Another eviction. She glanced at Malik, who waved his picture like a flag. But my son, and every child like him, is more than that. And when Judge Henshaw finally saw that, really saw it, he did something that no judge ever had before. She turned to face the panel. He stood with us. Moretti shifted uncomfortably. This hearing is not about. This hearing is about whether justice is a set of rules or a set of values. Angela interrupted again. And I think this committee needs to decide which one you really believe in. She stepped back, and the silence was deafening. One by one, others came forward. Lucia Alvarez, holding a photo of her daughter wheezing in their mold-filled bathroom. Devin Price, standing straighter than he had in years, testifying that a second chance gave him the courage to apply for college. Mrs. Green, clutching the keys to the apartment she was able to keep, her voice cracking with gratitude. The voices built upon each other, each testimony another brick in the bridge Henshaw had been trying to build. When they were done, Justice Moretti removed his glasses and sighed. This committee will deliberate. The deliberation took 3 days. 3 days where Henshaw returned home each night wondering if his career was over. 3 days where Angela kept her eviction notice pinned to her fridge. Not in fear, but as fuel. 3 days where Malik drew new pictures every morning, each one more hopeful than the last. On the 4th day, the committee reconvened. Justice Moretti's face was unreadable. After careful review, the committee finds that Judge Garrett Henshaw's actions represent a departure from standard judicial conduct. The room tensed. However, Moretti continued, we also recognize that the law is not meant to exist in isolation from the people it serves. And though Judge Henshaw's methods were unconventional, we cannot ignore the impact his rulings had, and the voices of the community who stood behind him. The silence stretched. Judge Henshaw will retain his seat, Moretti said, with the recommendation that his future rulings continue to reflect both impartiality and humanity. The room erupted in applause. Malik darted forward, his drawing still in hand, and Henshaw knelt down to take it. This is for you, Mr. Hammerman, Malik said proudly. 'Cause you're our hero now. Henshaw's throat tightened. No, Malik, he said softly. You and your mama. You're the heroes. I'm just lucky enough to follow your lead. Angela smiled, her arms folded across her chest. We told you, she said. Justice belongs to all of us. Henshaw straightened, holding Malik's picture high for everyone to see. And for the first time in his long career, the gavel in his hand didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like a promise.